At 50, after 22 years at the same logistics company, Della Williams walked out of a glass-doored office building in Charlotte carrying a cardboard box, a final paycheck folded into thirds, and the deed to her father's hangar on a forgotten airstrip 300 miles west. The hangar was the only thing she'd inherited that the bank, the credit cards, and the landlord couldn't touch. Her father had left it to her when he died 7 years ago, and she'd never once driven out to see it. Brennan Logistics had let her go on a Tuesday afternoon at 2:47 p.m. She remembered the time because the clock above her supervisor's head had ticked once, loud, in the silence after he said the word restructuring. 22 years of dispatch coordination, 2 department awards, and a perfect attendance record reduced to a manila folder, a severance offer that wouldn't cover 3 months of rent, and a security escort to the parking lot. The young man from HR didn't make eye contact when he handed her the cardboard box. He'd been hired 6 months earlier. Della had trained him. Some companies fire you. Some companies cut you loose. Brennan Logistics restructured Della Williams out of her own life and called it a business decision. She drove home that evening to an apartment she could no longer afford and a phone full of missed calls from her landlord, who had been threatening eviction for 2 months. The car payment was 30 days behind. The credit card she'd used to cover her mother's funeral 6 months ago was at its limit. Her checking account had $312 in it, and she had no idea how to make that number grow. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and tried to think of who she could call. Her ex-husband had remarried in Atlanta and stopped returning her texts years ago. Her daughter Imani was finishing graduate school in Boston and was already carrying loans Della had promised to help with. Della's mother was gone. Her father was gone. Her brother lived in Phoenix with 3 children of his own and a wife who answered the phone like every call was an emergency she didn't want. There was no one to call. There was nothing to call about. That night Della pulled a shoebox from the top of her closet, the one she hadn't opened since the week of her father's funeral. Inside was a stack of papers held together with a rubber band that had hardened into something more like wire. The deed was on top. Williams Aviation, established 1963, located on County Route 14 outside the town of Pine Hollow, 342 miles west of Charlotte, deeded to Della Renee Williams for the last will and testament of Otis James Williams, deceased. The hangar had been her father's life. A single-strip grass airfield with 1 corrugated metal building, a fuel pump for aviation gas, and a 1948 Piper Cub he'd restored from a wreck when she was 12. He'd flown crop dusters in the summers and taught flight lessons in the fall, and in between he'd repaired engines for every small plane owner within a 100-mile radius. He'd taken Della up in the Piper on her 10th birthday, and she still remembered the way the world looked from 1,000 feet up, how the cornfields became green rectangles and the rivers became silver thread, and her father's voice through the headset had said, "You see now, baby girl, it's all small. Everything that scares you down there is small from up here." She'd loved him. She had also let years pass without driving out to see him, because Charlotte had become her life, and the corporate ladder had become her ladder, and her father's tiny hangar in a town nobody had heard of had stopped being a place she thought about. She'd come for the funeral. She'd spent 3 days sorting through his clothes, locking the hangar doors, and driving back to a job that she'd believed would carry her into a comfortable retirement. Now the job was gone. The apartment was almost gone, and the only thing she owned outright, free and clear, was a building on a grass strip her father had bought before she was born. Della folded the deed and put it in her purse. By Friday morning, she had loaded what was left of her life into her 10-year-old Honda and pointed the car west. The drive took 6 hours, longer than it should have because Della stopped twice on the side of the interstate to put her forehead against the steering wheel and breathe. Not crying. The crying had happened the night the eviction notice was taped to her door, when she'd slid down the wall in her hallway and made sounds she didn't know her body could make. By Friday morning, the crying was finished. What was left was a hollow space where her certainty about the world used to live. Interstate gave way to state highway, which gave way to 2-lane road, which gave way to County Route 14, a strip of patched asphalt that ran through tobacco fields and pine woods and small towns where the gas stations had handwritten signs in the windows. Della passed a tractor moving at 15 miles an hour and waved when the driver lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel. The gesture surprised her. She hadn't been somewhere people waved at strangers in a long time. Pine Hollow had a population of 841 according to the green sign at the town limit. Della passed a Baptist church, a feed and seed store, a diner with 3 trucks in the parking lot, and a closed barbershop with a faded candy-striped pole. Then the town ended and the road climbed gently through hayfields. 2 miles past the last house, she saw the turnoff her father had described in her memory 100 times. A gravel drive on the left, marked by a wooden post that had once held a sign and now held only the rusted brackets. Della turned in slowly. The gravel was overgrown with grass down the center where tires hadn't passed in years. The drive curved through a stand of loblolly pines and opened onto a clearing maybe 4 acres wide. And there, at the far end, was Williams Aviation. The hangar was smaller than she remembered. A single corrugated metal building with a peaked roof, painted white once, now mostly gray-brown rust streaked down the seams. The 2 big sliding doors at the front were padlocked shut, the chain rusted into a single welded-looking mass. To the right of the hangar stood a smaller cinder-block building, what her father had called the office, with one window boarded over and the other intact, dusty but unbroken. The grass airstrip stretched out behind the hangar, 2,000 feet of overgrown field with a faded orange windsock at the far end, hanging limp from a leaning pole. Della parked the Honda in front of the office and got out. The air smelled like pine sap and dry grass and something underneath, the faint chemical tang of old aviation fuel. A grasshopper jumped from the gravel onto her shoe. She didn't move for a long moment. She had not stood on this property in 7 years. She walked to the office door. The key on the ring her father's lawyer had mailed her after the will was settled was labeled office in his block-letter handwriting. The lock resisted, then turned. Della pushed the door open and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Old paper, machine oil, coffee that had dried in a pot decades ago. The office was one square room with a wooden desk along the back wall, a metal filing cabinet in the corner, a wood-burning stove that hadn't been used in years, and a calendar from 2019 still pinned to the wall, open to the month her father had died, April. The page had a small notation in his handwriting on the 17th, Della's birthday. Call her, she had to sit down. There was a wooden chair behind the desk, the kind with a cracked leather cushion and brass tacks along the edges. She lowered herself into it and looked at the calendar for a long time. He had remembered her birthday. He had written it down. He had probably called and she didn't remember if she'd answered, and if she had, she didn't remember what they'd talked about. The desk had 3 drawers. She opened the top one. Pens, paper clips, a yellowed receipt book, a pack of cigarettes with 2 left inside, though he'd quit smoking when she was 19. The middle drawer had logbooks, the kind pilots and mechanics keep, leather-bound and worn smooth at the corners. She lifted one out and opened it to a random page. Her father's handwriting filled the lines, dated entries going back decades. Aircraft tail numbers, hours, repairs, signatures. She set the logbook on the desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a metal box with a small brass lock, and beside it, an envelope with her name on it. Della lifted the envelope out with both hands. The paper was thick and yellowed at the edges, and her name was written across the front in her father's careful block letters. Della Renee. He was the only person who had ever called her by both names. To everyone else she'd been Della, or Mrs. Williams, or Ma'am, or in the last year of her job, just the dispatch supervisor we're letting go. But to Otis Williams she had been Della Renee from the day she was born until the day he died. She didn't open the envelope yet. She set it on the desk beside the logbook and looked at it. The metal box she could deal with first. The lock was small and old, and one of the smaller keys on her father's ring slid into it and turned. Inside was a roll of cash wrapped in a rubber band, 20s and 10s, maybe $400 in total. A ring of keys she didn't recognize, 4 of them on a worn leather fob, a small notebook, the spiral-bound kind, and a folded sheet of paper that turned out to be the original deed to the property, dated 1963, transferring 41 acres from a man named Marcus Pendleton to Otis James Williams for the sum of $3,200. Della unfolded the deed and read it twice. 41 acres. She had thought the property was maybe 4, maybe 5. The hangar and the airstrip and a thin band of trees. But the deed described a tract that ran from County Route 14 back through the woods to a creek her father had once told her was good for fishing, then north along the creek to a rocky outcrop, then west to a fence line. 41 acres. Most of it timber and pasture, but 41 acres in a county where land was selling. She set the deed down and picked up the spiral notebook. The first page was dated 38 years ago. Her father's handwriting, smaller than on the calendar, more careful. Started keeping this so I don't forget. Lent Jimmy Prout $40 for the part on his Cessna. He's good for it but won't be able to pay till harvest. Told him not to worry. Boy's trying to start a crop dusting service and the world needs more boys who try things. Della turned the page. Fixed the magneto on Reverend Hatcher's plane. Wouldn't take his money. He flies that thing to do hospital visits in 3 counties. A man doing the Lord's work shouldn't be paying me for a magneto. Helped Earlene Spruill get her late husband's plane sold. Got her a fair price. She tried to give me a commission. Told her I'd take a slice of her sweet potato pie instead. She brought one over Sunday. Best pie in 3 counties. Page after page. Year after year. Della read with her hand pressed against her mouth. Her father had spent 4 decades quietly holding together a piece of the world she had never even thought to look at. Loans to young pilots starting out. Free repairs for the old ones running out of money. Sold planes for widows who didn't know what they were worth. Taught flight lessons to kids whose parents couldn't pay, on the condition that the kids would come back and sweep the hangar floor on Saturdays. Some of the entries had follow-ups. Jimmy Prout paid back the $40 in November, 3 years late, in singles he'd been saving in a coffee can. Wouldn't let me refuse it. He's got a wife now and a baby on the way. The crop dusting business is going. Reverend Hatcher's plane crashed in a field outside Asheville. He survived. The plane didn't. Helped him find another one through a man I know in Greensboro. Got it for half the going price. Reverend says I'll be in his prayers forever. Told him I'd settle for once a week. Della read until the light in the office shifted gold across the desk. She had not eaten since the rest area outside Greensboro that morning. She had not stood up from the chair in over an hour. Her back ached and her eyes burned, and she didn't care. She looked at the envelope with her name on it. She wasn't ready to open it yet. Something in her knew that whatever was inside would change the shape of this day permanently, and she wanted to hold the rest of the day in her hands a little longer before that happened. Della stepped out of the office into late afternoon light that had gone honey-colored across the clearing. The pines threw long shadows toward the hangar. Somewhere in the woods, a woodpecker hammered against a dead tree, then stopped. The sound of her own footsteps on the gravel was the loudest thing in the world. She walked around to the side of the hangar. The big sliding doors at the front were chained, but her father had built a smaller door into the side wall, the kind a man could walk through without sliding the big ones open. She tried the keys from the metal box. The third one fit. The lock turned with a dry click and she pushed the door open. The inside of the hangar was dim, lit only by the bands of light coming through gaps in the metal siding and a row of high windows along the back wall that had once been clear and were now milky with dust. Della stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. And then she saw the plane. The Piper Cub sat in the center of the hangar floor where her father had left it. Cream yellow paint, faded but unbroken, with a dark blue stripe running the length of the fuselage. The tail number was still readable. N4127K. The propeller was wood, two-bladed, gleaming faintly under a layer of dust. The wings stretched out on either side like something asleep but not dead. A canvas tarp had been draped over the cockpit, tied down at the corners. The tires were flat. A film of dust and pollen and what looked like a decade of small spider webs covered everything. But the plane was whole. Della walked to it slowly. She had not seen this aircraft since she was a child. Her father had taken it out the morning of her 10th birthday, lifted her into the front seat, fastened the harness across her small chest, and flown her over the cornfields and the rivers and the green rectangles of the world. He had been 42 years old. She had thought he was the strongest man alive. She put her hand on the wing. The metal was cool under her palm, and the texture of the canvas covering felt the way she remembered, taut and slightly waxy. She walked around to the cockpit and lifted a corner of the tarp. The instruments were intact. The leather seat was cracked but in place. A pair of leather flight gloves rested on the seat, folded neatly, as if her father had taken them off one evening and set them down planning to come back the next morning. Della stood there a long time. She had not allowed herself to remember the flying part of him. After her mother died, after she'd moved to Charlotte, after her marriage had begun its slow collapse, and the corporate work had become the only thing she could measure her days by, she had let the memory of her father in his Piper Cub fade, because it had not been useful to her in that life. A successful dispatch supervisor in Charlotte did not need to think about a black man in coveralls flying a crop duster over North Carolina pine country. That man had not fit into the version of herself she'd been trying to build. Now the version of herself she'd been trying to build was gone. Brennan Logistics had taken it. And what was left, what she found herself standing inside, was a hangar her father had kept clean and locked for the last decade of his life, a plane he had restored from a wreck before she was born, and a small voice underneath everything that said, "He left this for you." She let the tarp drop. She walked back toward the doorway and looked around the hangar one more time. Along the back wall were her father's tools, hung on pegboards just like Earl Macklin's, organized by size and function, each one outlined in black marker. Wrenches and torque drivers and aircraft-specific tools she didn't recognize. A workbench ran the length of the wall with a vise bolted to one end, and a metal lamp that probably still worked. In the corner, a second smaller plane sat under a tarp, just a shape under canvas. Della would lift that tarp another day. She locked the side door behind her and walked back to the office. The envelope with her name on it was still on the desk where she had left it. She sat down in the chair, picked it up, and slid her finger under the flap. Inside the envelope were 3 sheets of lined paper, folded in thirds, written on both sides in her father's careful block letters. Della unfolded them and smoothed them flat against the desk. "Della Renee, if you're reading this, you finally came home. I don't know what brought you. Could be I'm dead and the lawyer mailed you the keys. Could be something else happened in Charlotte that made you remember this place. Either way, I'm glad you're sitting in that chair. I sat in it for 41 years, and it held me up through plenty. I want to tell you some things I never could when I was alive. Not because they were secrets, but because you and I had a way of talking that wasn't built for them. You'd call once a month and ask if I was eating right, and I'd tell you yes, and we'd talk about Imani and the weather, and then we'd hang up. That was good. That was love, the kind we could manage. But there were bigger things I wanted to say, and I never could find the door to say them through. So I'm writing them down. This hangar is more than a building. The land is more than the building sits on. Your grandfather bought the parcel in 1963 from a white man named Marcus Pendleton, who was selling because the county was changing and he wanted out. Marcus charged your grandfather a fair price when nobody else would sell to a black man at all in this part of the state. I always remembered that. I tried to be the kind of man who would have charged Marcus a fair price back, if it had ever gone the other way. Your grandfather wanted a place where a black man could work with his hands and own what he made. He picked aviation because he loved it, and because nobody could tell him his sky was the wrong sky. He died before he could fly. I inherited the land and the dream, and I learned to fly on borrowed time and borrowed planes, and I built this hangar with my own 2 hands and the help of friends who are most of them gone now. I want you to know that the property is paid for. There are no liens, no mortgages, no debts against it. The taxes are current through the year of my death and a little beyond because I prepaid when I knew I was sick. After that, you'll owe the county. Talk to a man named Curtis Hatcher at the courthouse. He's the reverend son and he'll do right by you. The Piper is yours. She still flies, or she did the last time I took her up, which was about 2 months before the diagnosis. Engine's solid. Annual inspection lapsed, so she'll need that before she's legal again. There's a mechanic in Hickory named Floyd Beasley who knew me and knew this plane. He'll do the inspection for you fair. The Cessna under the tarp in the back corner is not mine. It belongs to a man named Wade Carrington who left it here in 2014 saying he'd be back for it and never came. I tried to find him. His sister told me he passed in 2017. I never had the heart to do anything with the plane. If you can find his family, it should go to them. If you can't, after 7 years from his death, the law says it's yours to dispose of. That's something for you to figure out. There's money in the metal box in the desk. Not much, 400 and change. I kept it there for emergencies. Use it for whatever you need. The notebooks in the middle drawer are mine. 40 years of work. I wrote them so somebody would know what this place was for, in case somebody ever wanted to know. I hoped that somebody would be you, but I made my peace with the chance it wouldn't be. If you're reading this, then the somebody is you. Read them when you have time. They'll tell you who we were out here. Last thing. You were not a disappointment, Della Renee. Whatever you thought, whatever the silence between us ever made you think, you were not. You were my girl from the day you were born, and you stayed my girl every day after. The distance was geography. The love was never in doubt. Come home if you need to. The door is open. Daddy. Della pressed the letter to her chest. The light in the office had gone from gold to amber to the deep blue of dusk, and she had not moved. Della slept that first night on the leather chair behind the desk. She hadn't planned to. She meant to drive back into Pine Hollow and find a motel, or sleep in the car if the motel was too expensive. But she'd sat in the chair holding her father's letter for so long that the dark came down and she didn't have the energy to get up. She pulled her jacket over her shoulders, tipped her head back, and was asleep within minutes. She woke to the sound of an engine. The light in the office was pale gray, the kind that meant the sun was still behind the pines, but the sky had already started its turn toward day. Della sat up. Her neck was stiff and her mouth tasted like she'd been chewing on coins. The engine she'd heard was outside, a truck, slowing on the gravel and then stopping. She stood up, smoothed her shirt, and opened the office door. A man was getting out of an old red Ford pickup. He was tall, in his late 60s or early 70s, with a beard that had gone fully white and shoulders that still looked like they could lift a tractor tire. He wore canvas work pants, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, and a feed store cap. When he saw Della standing in the doorway, he stopped where he was and took off the cap. "Lord have mercy," he said. "You're Otis's girl." Della nodded. She didn't trust her voice yet. "I'm Floyd Beasley," he said. "Drove out 'cause I saw a car turn down this drive last evening from up at my place." He pointed back over his shoulder vaguely toward a ridge Della couldn't see through the pines. "Hadn't seen tire tracks on this gravel in I don't know how long. Figured I'd check who it was." Floyd Beasley, the mechanic her father had named in the letter. "Della Williams," she said. "Otis was my father. I know who you are." Floyd's face softened into something that wasn't quite a smile but was warmer than one. "Your daddy used to show me your picture. Had one tucked in the visor of his truck. Said you were the smartest one he ever made." Della's eyes stung. She hadn't expected that this early in the morning from a stranger. "You hungry?" Floyd asked. "'Cause I was about to go get breakfast at Lorraine's and I'd be glad of the company." She was hungry. She was also broke in a way that made breakfast at a diner feel impossible. Floyd seemed to read her hesitation because he shook his head before she could speak. "I'm buying," he said. "Don't you tell me otherwise. Your daddy bought me about 400 breakfasts over the years, time I started settling up." Lorraine's diner had 4 booths, a counter with 6 stools, and a hand-lettered chalkboard listing the day's special. Floyd held the door for Della and waved at the woman behind the counter. "Lorraine, this here is Otis Williams's daughter." The woman looked up from a coffee pot. She was maybe 60, light brown skin, gray hair tied back with a red bandana. She set the pot down very slowly. Then she came around the counter and pulled Della into a hug that lasted longer than Della had been hugged by anyone in years. "Baby," Lorraine said, "your daddy talked about you so much I feel like I raised you." Della laughed for the first time in what felt like months. It came out shaky. They sat in a booth by the window. Floyd ordered eggs and bacon and grits. Della ordered the same because she couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a real breakfast. Lorraine brought coffee in heavy white mugs and refused to take Della's money for it, even before Floyd reminded her he was paying. "Your father saved my husband's life," Lorraine said. 1996. Vernon had a heart attack out at the airstrip waiting on a delivery. Your daddy did CPR for 11 minutes till the ambulance got there. 11 minutes. She set the coffee down with both hands. Vernon lived another 19 years after that. We named our youngest after him, Otis Vernon. He's in the Air Force now. Della couldn't speak. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked out the window at Main Street, where a man in a John Deere cap was unlocking the hardware store across the way. Pine Hollow was waking up. Her father had been here. He had been here in this diner with these people, and she had not known. Floyd drove Della back to the hangar after breakfast. He followed her down the gravel drive in his red Ford and parked beside her Honda. When he climbed out, he stood for a moment looking at the building the way a man looks at an old friend he hasn't seen in a long time. "Last time I was out here was the week after he passed," Floyd said. "Helped clean up some, locked her down, figured somebody'd be back eventually. It took me 7 years. You're here now." Della unlocked the side door of the hangar and pushed it open. Floyd stepped inside and let out a low whistle that was almost a hum. He walked to the Piper Cub and ran his hand along the wing the way Della had done the day before, the same slow, careful motion of someone touching something they remembered. "She's still in there," he said, mostly to himself. He lifted the corner of the tarp covering the cockpit and looked at the instruments. Annual lapsed about a year and a half before he died. He stopped flying when the cancer hit, said he didn't trust his hands anymore. "My father had cancer." Floyd turned to look at her. His face changed. "You didn't know?" "He told me he was sick. He didn't say what." Floyd was quiet for a long moment. He let the tarp drop and turned all the way around to face her. "Pancreatic," he said. "Caught it late. He had about 8 months from diagnosis to the end. He drove himself to chemo for the first 3 months, and then I started driving him because he asked me to. He didn't want anyone making a fuss." Floyd paused. "He said he didn't want to scare you. Said you had your own life and he'd handled his own life for 68 years and he wasn't gonna change his policy now." Della had to sit down. There was a wooden crate against the hangar wall and she lowered herself onto it. Floyd didn't try to fill the silence. He waited. She had visited her father in the hospital for 2 days at the very end. She had flown in from Charlotte, and he had been thin and gray and almost too tired to talk, and she had held his hand and told him she loved him, and he had told her the same, and she had believed she was witnessing the swift ending of a man who had been mostly well until very recently. She had not understood that he had carried 8 months of dying alone by his own choice because he had not wanted to disrupt her life. "I would have come," she said. Her voice was small. "He knew you would have," Floyd said. "That's why he didn't tell you. He didn't want you coming for the dying. He wanted you to come for the living if you ever did. He hoped you would." Della pressed both hands to her face. Floyd let her sit. He walked over to the workbench along the back wall and started touching the tools, one at a time, the way you greet old companions. He picked up a torque wrench, weighed it in his hand, set it back. He ran his fingers along the edge of the vise. He pulled out a small drawer under the bench and looked inside, then closed it. After a while he said, without turning around, "What's your plan, Della?" She lowered her hands. She had no plan. She had $312, a car that needed an oil change, an apartment she was about to be evicted from, a daughter in graduate school who didn't know any of this yet, and 41 acres in Pine Hollow, North Carolina, with a hangar and a plane she didn't know how to fly. "I don't have one," she said. "You thinking about selling?" She looked at the Piper Cub. She looked at the workbench. She looked at the high windows where the morning light was coming through in pale bars. "No," she said. The word came out before she had decided to say it. Floyd nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer. "All right then," he said. "Then here's what we do. I do the annual on this plane. I do it for free 'cause your daddy paid me forward about 12 times in his lifetime, and I owe his memory at least one airplane. Once she's legal again, we figure out the rest. Floyd, I can't fly her. You will, Floyd said. Your daddy taught you when you were 10. The body remembers. The annual inspection took Floyd 3 weeks. He came every morning at 7, brought his own coffee in a steel thermos, and worked on the Piper until the heat of the afternoon ran him out of the hangar. He brought his own parts. When Della asked him what she owed, he waved her off the same way Lorraine had waved off the breakfast money. Settling up, he said. Don't ask me again. Della spent those 3 weeks doing the work she could do. She cleaned the office until the floor showed its grain. She washed the windows of the hangar with vinegar and old newspaper from a stack she found in the corner. She pulled the boards off the office window and replaced the cracked glass with a piece Floyd cut for her at his own shop. She found a broom and swept the hangar floor every morning. She found her father's coffee pot in a cabinet and ran it through the dishwasher at Lorraine's, and Lorraine wouldn't let her put it back in the car without filling the back seat with a bag of biscuits and a jar of fig preserves. The town came in slowly. A man named Curtis Hatcher drove out the second week, and Della understood from the way he introduced himself that this was the reverend son her father had mentioned in the letter. He was the assistant clerk at the courthouse. He brought her a folder of property tax records and walked her through what she owed and what the projected assessments looked like. He told her the county had eyes on land out this way because a regional development corporation had been buying up small parcels along Route 14 for 2 years. He told her not to sell to them. Why not? Della asked. 'Cause they're paying about 60 cents on the dollar, Curtis said. And your daddy specifically asked me to tell you that if anybody from Tidewater Holdings came knocking, you should send them straight to hell with a sandwich. Curtis didn't smile, but his eyes did. That's a direct quote. I have it in a note he gave me in 2018. Tidewater Holdings sent a representative the 3rd week, a young white man in a navy suit and brown loafers who drove up the gravel drive in a leased SUV and got out smiling. Della watched him from the office window. She finished her coffee before she went outside. Mrs. Williams, he said when she stepped onto the porch. Brent Halloway with Tidewater Holdings. I wonder if you have a moment to talk about your property. I don't, he blinked. He had clearly rehearsed an opening that assumed she would have a moment. Ma'am, I think you'll be very interested in our offer. We're prepared to discuss numbers that, my father told the county clerk to send you to hell with a sandwich, Della said. I don't have any sandwiches, so you can drive yourself. Brent Halloway stared at her for a long second. Then he laughed, a short, startled laugh that he tried to cover with a cough. He held up both hands. All right, Mrs. Williams, all right. Here's my card if anything changes. It won't. He drove off down the gravel. Della stood on the porch of the office and watched the SUV disappear into the pines, and then she walked back inside and threw the card in the wood stove without reading the number on it. That evening Floyd told her the Piper was legal. She's done, he said, wiping his hands on a rag from the workbench. I taxied her up and down the strip this afternoon while you were at the courthouse. Engine's good, controls are tight, tires hold air. She's ready. Della stood in the hangar doorway looking at the plane. The afternoon sun was coming through the open big doors, which Floyd had managed to free by cutting the rusted chain with a bolt cutter and oiling the runners. The Piper Cub sat in a square of sunlight, cream yellow and dark blue, the propeller polished, the windshield clean. Floyd, I haven't flown in 40 years. 41, Floyd said. I know, you flew with your daddy on your 10th birthday, he told me. That was one flight when I was a child. It was the first one. The second one is tomorrow morning. I'll be in the back seat. You'll be in the front. We'll do touch and goes till you remember. Della opened her mouth to argue and didn't. 6 a.m., Floyd said. Wear long sleeves. Cockpit's drafty. He locked the hangar doors, tipped his cap, and drove home. Della did not sleep. She lay on a folding cot Lorraine had loaned her, set up in the office corner, and stared at the ceiling for hours. Twice she got up and went outside and stood on the gravel and looked at the hangar in the moonlight, and twice she went back inside and lay down again. At 4:30 she gave up, made coffee, and sat on the office porch watching the eastern sky turn from black to indigo to the pale gray that meant morning was almost here. Floyd arrived at 5:50. He didn't talk much. He pulled the big sliding doors open and walked Della through the pre-flight check the way her father had once walked her through, tying her shoes, slow and patient, nomming everything. Control surfaces, fuel sumps, oil level, tire pressure. He let her do each step herself. When she fumbled the fuel cap, he didn't correct her. He waited until she figured out which way to turn it. "Climb in," he said when the walk-around was done. The cockpit was tighter than she remembered. She fit herself into the front seat, fastened the harness across her chest, settled her feet on the rudder pedals. Floyd climbed into the back. He handed her a headset over her shoulder and she put it on. Her hands were shaking. "Della Renee," Floyd's voice came through the headset, calm as a Sunday morning. "Your daddy taught you the throttle is your friend, you remember that?" She remembered. She had been 10. The voice in her headset had been her father's, and he had said, "The throttle is your friend, baby girl. Push it slow and steady. The plane wants to fly, you just have to let her." "I remember," she said. "Then let's go let her." Della pushed the throttle. The Piper rolled forward out of the hangar into the gold of early sun. She taxied across the apron and onto the grass strip slowly, getting the feel of the rudder pedals. The plane responded the way Floyd had said it would. Her hands knew things her mind had forgotten. At the end of the strip, she turned the Piper into the wind. The windsock at the far end of the field was lifting just enough to point east. "Throttle up when you're ready," Floyd said. "I'm here. I won't let you crash." Della took a breath. She pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared and the Piper began to roll faster, faster, and she felt the tail come up, and then the wheels left the grass and the ground fell away. She was flying. The plane climbed slowly into the morning. Below her, the hangar shrank to a small white shape with a dark roof. The gravel drive became a thin gray line through the pines. Route 14 became a ribbon. Pine Hollow appeared off to the right, a cluster of rooftops and the steeple of the Baptist church, and beyond it the fields and the woods and the rolling country her father had flown over 1,000 times. "You see now, baby girl," Floyd said, and Della understood that he was repeating words her father had told him to repeat, words he had carried for 7 years waiting for this morning. "It's all small. Everything that scares you down there is small from up here." Della was crying. She was flying and crying at the same time, and she could not have said which was easier. They did touch and goes for an hour. Floyd talked her through each landing, each takeoff, each turn around the pattern. The body remembered. By the 8th landing her hands had stopped shaking. By the 12th she was laughing. When they finally taxied back to the hangar, the sun was full up and Floyd was grinning behind her in a way she could see in the side mirror. She shut down the engine. She sat in the cockpit with her hands on the yoke for a long moment after the propeller stopped turning. "Floyd," she said, "I don't know what I'm doing yet, but I think I'm going to reopen this place." "I know you are," Floyd said. "I knew it the first morning at Lorraine's." He climbed out of the back seat, hopped down to the grass, and held out a hand to help her down from the front. She didn't need the hand. She took it anyway. They walked back to the office together. Lorraine's truck was already parked beside Della's Honda, and Lorraine was carrying a full-covered pan up the porch steps. Lorraine had brought breakfast casserole and a thermos of fresh coffee and a question. She set the pan on the desk in the office and turned to Della with her hands on her hips. "So when are you opening?" "Lorraine, I don't even know what I'm opening yet." "You're opening what your daddy had. Flight lessons, repairs, fuel. Maybe a little crop work in season if you can find a pilot willing. Floyd can do the wrench work till you find somebody younger. You can do the books and the lessons once you've got your license back current." Lorraine poured coffee into 3 mugs without asking. "And I can spread the word inside a week. People around here have been waiting on this hangar to come back since the day Otis got sick. I'm not licensed to teach. You will be. There's a man in Hickory does the refresher courses for lapsed pilots. 6 weeks. I already called him. He owes Floyd a favor." Della looked at Floyd. Floyd looked at the ceiling. "You called him already?" Della said. "Last week," Lorraine said. "Don't be mad, I had a feeling." Della laughed. The laugh kept going longer than the joke deserved. because what she was actually laughing at was the realization that she had spent 22 years in a city believing she had built a life from nothing. And now, she was standing in a hangar her father had built from nothing, surrounded by people who had been waiting 7 years to help her step into a life that had been waiting too. The refresher course took 6 weeks, as promised. Della drove to Hickory 3 days a week and slept on Floyd's couch the nights she had early classes. She passed her check ride at the end of August. The instructor signed her logbook and shook her hand and told her father would have been proud, and Della thanked him without crying, which felt like its own small accomplishment. Williams Aviation reopened on the first Saturday in September. It was not a grand opening. There were no banners. Lorraine had told people to come, and people had told other people, and by 10 o'clock that morning the gravel lot held 23 vehicles, and the porch of the office was so full that men were standing in the grass holding paper plates of biscuits and pulled pork. Reverend Hatcher had come, 81 years old now, leaning on a cane, and he had stood in front of the hangar and said a prayer that made grown men take off their hats. Curtis Hatcher had brought a hand-painted sign that read WILLIAMS Aviation, ESD. 1963, in the same block letters her father had used. He had nailed it above the office door himself. Imani flew in from Boston that morning. Della had not told her daughter much over the previous months. A few phone calls, a few careful explanations. Imani had arrived the night before, walked into the office, looked at her mother for a long moment, and then sat down in the leather chair and put her face in her hands and cried in a way Della had not seen her cry since her grandmother's funeral. When Imani finally lifted her face, she said, "Mama, why didn't you tell me you were doing this?" "Because I didn't believe I was doing it," Della said, "until I was already doing it." The Cessna in the back corner went home eventually. Della found Wade Carrington's nephew through a long chain of phone calls. The young man drove up from South Carolina in October, walked into the hangar and stood in front of his uncle's plane for 10 minutes without speaking. Della helped him arrange a tow. She did not charge him for the 7 years of storage. She remembered her father's letter and what he would have done. The first paying student showed up in the second week. A 15-year-old girl from Pine Hollow named Tasha Beasley, Floyd's great-niece, who had wanted to be a pilot since she was 6. Della charged her half the going rate and told her she'd cover the other half if Tasha would sweep the hangar floor on Saturday mornings. Tasha agreed. By the end of her first year back, Della had 11 students, a small steady stream of repair work, a fuel contract she could meet without anxiety, and a savings account with more in it than she had ever held in Charlotte. She kept her father's reading glasses on the desk in the office. She kept the calendar from April 2019 on the wall. She was 51 years old. She had finally come home.